What's up, everybody? I'm Stan, and welcome to Detail Comics, where we go over comics in detail. This is iRate Reviews, the weekly review show where I go over a comic book, its art, its story, as well as give you my impressions on it and whether it's something you should go back to the comic book shop for or not. I'm going to be talking about Reborn number 2. So Reborn is a book by Mark Millar and Greg Capullo, and it deals with kind of like life and death and what we know about it versus what we don't know about it. So the way that the story opened up in issue 1 is that ultimately we see the backstory of our main character, Bonnie, and how she lived her life. Overall it seemed like it's a very fulfilling life. She was, elderly and passed away, gently as part of this aspect, and was reborn as a younger 20-something version of herself, immediately thrust into this fantasy realm. And we just dive right in from there as well. When it comes to Reborn, this is going to be a very interesting take because first off, let's touch on the art, because the art in this is fantastic. And I don't want to talk about every single panel in it because I would just gush. I would go over it for hours and hours and hours because Greg Capullo is doing a masterstroke. So, you've got Greg Capullo on the pencils, you've got Jonathan Glapion on the actual inks themselves, and then FCO, I can't really pronounce his last name, but ultimately that group of them is putting out the best in art that I can really see. It's just a staggering amount of potential that goes into this. And when we come to the story kind of needs that, because the story fell a little bit more flat in the second issue compared to issue number 1. Where we pick up, we finally see this kind of sprawling, expansive world, which happens to be 10 times larger than Earth itself, which Bonnie learns from her father, simply because he's been looking his entire life for his wife, and he has yet to be able to find her. However, there are some certain characters around her that are from her earlier life. So, you've got her neighbor that used to feed her birds. There was this teacher or something along those lines. And ultimately she's got her dog, the dog that she grew up with. So it's really cool to see these different characters really tied into Bonnie around her and surrounding her as this kind of goes forward. But this also leads to a few interesting theories that I'm going to touch around a little bit later in the video. As we kind of go around, you realize that Bonnie, her whole characterization means that the better things, the nicer she was, the better she treated other people in her life, as she was living, the more powerful and the more resourceful she would be in this new world. So that means that as a teacher, always treating people right, always doing the right thing, it really made her this savior, which had to go up against these dark forces that are in the land that they've always been at war against. Nobody really knows why, but they've always been at war with these dark forces. However, being fresh to this world, Bonnie has only really one concern, and that is to try and find her husband who was deceased before her. She's been grieving for quite some time, and she'd love to be reunited with him, but that's going to take a little bit of time. So they agree that about a month is going to be needed in order for her to venture out and try and, find her husband. But they're going to stop by an old friend of hers first, which happens to be the Queen of the Fairies. And again, art, impressive, super, super good. It's so awesome to see Greg Capullo in this kind of setting compared to Batman, because he drew Batman so well, and now he just draws everything really well. It's just a really good setup for this. You can tell that I'm not really being too detailed because there's not really a whole heck of a lot of details going in on the story. So while we see that she's not getting any help from the Queen of the Fairies and she's still venturing out after her husband, we get introduced to Golgotha, who's the antagonist, the big bad of this whole thing. Think Ganon or Ganondorf from Legend of Zelda. He's that kind of guy that's sitting in his castle in the Dark Realm. And we see that not everybody is such a huge fan of Bonnie sometimes, because General Frost just happened to be her cat who had his balls cut off when he was like 9 months old, and he's really holding a grudge evidently. So he's part of this story too. So this is where the theory crafting kind of comes in. When I start to theory craft about Reborn itself is like this overall expansive land that is created out of the life forces of everybody and anybody that's interacted with Bonnie, or just in the world in general. However, what it comes down to is that this seems supremely focused on Bonnie herself. So when it comes to who these characters are, everybody is in relation to the main character. And the main character, this gives me a little bit of an impression that this is a unique circumstance for her, not necessarily for anybody else. So if you were another person in her lifetime, something along those lines, you wouldn't necessarily be experiencing it as that person, and she is like the best, she's like the pinnacle. That doesn't necessarily feel right, and if that is, that's a really terrible story that Mark Millar is writing. It's just like, if you're just an average person, you're just going to be hanging around in the afterlife, possibly getting abducted, being bled out into a pool for this demon lord, while your friend who lived down the street, she was a saint, so she is going to be the savior. Like, that just feels like crap, man. Like, that's just a sour note to really end this on. I mean, it's a great adventure story. It's a great hero's journey, but if you're talking about it in a proportion of the people that knew her in her life, that sucks. So this is going to be, if I'm theorizing this correctly, that this would be a unique individual story for every single person that would pass on. They would have their own setup. They would necessarily be, they probably would be like their own hero or their own villain or something like this, because that's the only way that it would make like sense. There's a lot of logical leaps. There's a lot of things that you've got to take at face value in order for them to kind of work out in that proper respect. But overall, it still doesn't really dampen my spirits in terms of the way things are going. If I take myself out of it a little bit more, if I pull back my brain and I'm just like, okay, no, I totally get it. She is the best. She's the savior. She's the one that's going to be setting these lands free. Okay, cool. We're in that mindset. It's a very enjoyable read. But ultimately, I'm interested to see how these other things are fleshed out, like her relationship with other characters, who the people in the dark side are, because I've got some theories about that too, but they might be a little bit spoilery. Overall, Reborn is still a super fun book. It's a little bit thinner in terms of its story and plot in this second issue, but just read it to look at Greg Capullo's art, because it is staggering. Definitely a recommended pickup. I can totally understand if it's not necessarily for you, but it's one that I'm going to keep reading as well. So that's my review of Reborn number 2, but I want to know what you guys thought too. Am I totally off base with this theory, or am I kind of hitting on something? So let me know in the comments down below and we can start that conversation. As always, if you like what you see, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe right there to get more news, reviews, and commentary on comic books, comic book movies, comic book TV shows and games, and anything and everything having to do with comics.